Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Wednesday, October 12th, the real Columbus Day. Wednesday, October 12th, 2022. It's a little after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Our guest, of course, needs no introduction to the audience. He is one of our mainstays and go-to guests on matters military, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Colonel, it's a pleasure. Welcome back to Judging Freedom. I'm going to start the way I usually start with you, sir. Can Russia lose this war?
No, not a chance.
Not a chance. Since we spoke last, the Ukrainians have disabled a portion of, they haven't destroyed, the major bridge into and out of Crimea. President Putin has apparently, since he doesn't announce these things, responded by attacking non-military targets. The Ukrainians continue to insist that they are pushing the Russians back. How do you see this going in light of the events that have occurred since last we spoke? And you may take issue with my summary of them. My summary is based on what I gleaned from your writings, from our colleague Scott Ritter and our former friends in the mainstream media.
That's right. First of all, just to go very quickly to the bridge, that was a truck bomb, and the evidence is mounting that the SAS had a hand in it. It was a very elaborate plan. The British Special Operations Forces. That's what's coming out in open source, which doesn't surprise me. The SAS, by the way, is far more audacious than our own. And they seem to have had a hand in building this truck bomb, moving it around through Armenia and into Russia, and then driving it up to the bridge. Having said that, the damage is really quite minimal. And it did not interrupt the rail traffic, which is really what's critical, because Russian logistics depend heavily on railroads. They cross the vast distances in that country with ease and move most of the equipment and people. And the spans themselves, there are still 2 lanes carrying truck and automobile traffic. So I think we really grossly, as usual, exaggerated the impact of that. Now, as far as
did the British special forces miss their mark? I mean, did they really think that this bomb would slice the bridge in 2 and prevent all traffic from going across it?
Who knows? I mean, how much of that they did, and how much the Ukrainians that were working with them did, who knows? I just thought it was interesting that in British sources, open sources, as elsewhere, people are mentioning the SAS, and I'm not surprised, because they are actually very effective, and I've seen them in action 20 years ago and 30 years ago. They're very good. Now,
do they do underwater work? Might they have attacked the Nord Stream pipeline?
I have no idea. That's a question I can't answer. I simply don't know. So again, if I had the facts, I would say something. I don't have all the facts on the bridge, but I know what didn't happen, and I know what's coming out through open source material.
Is there any more intel or any more analysis from you about the Nord Stream attack, which of course now is nowhere near the front pages? Once they hit that bridge, people forgot about Nord Stream. Has it been repaired? Is gas going through it? Has anybody claimed responsibility? Is there any evidence as to who might have done it?
I haven't anything more to add, other than to say that apparently one pipeline in the conglomeration of pipelines that constitute Nord Stream 2 apparently is still full of natural gas. Hasn't been damaged, and the Germans, and I think with the Danes and the Swedes, are investigating, but German spokesmen and the government have already said it looks as though they can repair it, Judge. So we'll see what happens. I'm sure the Germans will do everything in their power to repair the damage if it's repairable. So no, I have nothing else to add to that.
I'm of the view that President Putin's saber rattling of nuclear weapons and President Biden's, what I think are reckless responses, are not serious and are just aimed for the television audience. I can't imagine Putin using any form of a nuclear weapon or chemical weapon. Can you?
No, it's off the table, and there is no evidence whatsoever that the Russians are moving any nuclear warheads or preparing to use a nuclear weapon of any kind. So that's
what kind of a nuclear weapon would they use? Give us a little bit of an education. We're not talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This must be some sort of a low yield, if such a thing exists, defined weapon that hits a specific target. No?
I would tell you that unless they are attacked with a nuclear weapon themselves, they will not employ one. And that's been made clear repeatedly. What Putin said before the intervention in Ukraine, this is actually in 2021, in response to statements by Zelensky, who was talking then about acquiring nuclear weapons, is that he warned Zelensky that if they acquired those weapons, that Russia would treat that as an imminent threat, an existential threat to Russia. And subsequently, he made it clear on more than one occasion that if they are attacked by a nuclear weapon, that they will respond, they will retaliate. Now, he and others who work with him have always said that our discussions, which are widespread in the United States right now, about the potential use of low-yield nuclear weapons, that is 5 kilotons or less, is insanity. They stick really closely to the notion of mutual assured destruction. And when we talk about limited nuclear strikes, limited nuclear war, which is what you're getting at, they see that as very dangerous because, again, their inclination is to regard the use of any nuclear weapon by us as an existential threat, precipitating a first strike from the Soviet or the Russian arsenal. Remember, they've got some 630 warheads, 6,300 warheads, about 500 more than we've got.
All right. So what is a nuclear weapon today? Is it the Fat Boy, which was the nickname for what they dropped on Hiroshima? Is it a bomb that comes out of a B-52? Is it a missile? Does it aim at the Empire State Building?
The missiles, what is it? The predominant means of delivery today is a missile. Now, we do have the capacity, and so do the Russians, to try and fly a bomber and deliver ordnance. Probability of that happening now is very low. Bombers are likely, if anybody thinks that they're carrying a nuclear weapon, they're going to be shot down. Bombers are not invincible, invisible, invulnerable. It's a lot of nonsense. Stealth is an illusion. Forget it. It can sometimes delay detection, but it cannot avoid detection. So the missile is the way it would be delivered, either from submarine or from land-based systems, predominantly mobile systems in the Russian case.
And what does low yield mean in terms of people in the streets? Do they die, or does the nuclear stuff go away after a day? Or will it have the type of long-term effect that Hiroshima and Nagasaki had on the poor souls that were victimized by it?
Any nuclear weapon always results in blast, heat, and radiation. Now, a low-yield nuclear weapon, if it were delivered against a Capitol building, would annihilate everything in the immediate capital area. You know, for those of you that know Washington, D.C., from the rail yards over to the Navy Yard, as an example, absolutely, without question, would be destroyed. Will there be fallout? Absolutely. There's always radiation. Much depends on the altitude at which the nuclear weapon is detonated. Now, I don't see that happening. I happen to agree with you. I don't see any evidence that the people at the top of this administration are dangerous or insane in that sense. I think they understand the consequences. I wish they'd shut up and stop talking about it. Putin clearly understands the consequences and is not going to go there.
All right. Have the 300,000 reservists that Putin called up gone through their training, and are they at the front lines, or has the battlefield, in quotes, not yet felt the effect of the people the manpower that he called up a couple of weeks or about a month ago now?
No, the battlefield is not feeling the impact of those reservists yet. The reservists, and I can't tell you what percentage is now joining units and what percentage may still be in training, but the mobilization has gone very smoothly, contrary to the reports here in the West. We keep talking about hundreds of thousands of people running away. I don't see any evidence for that. Some, yes, lots, no. And in fact, the mobilization has had a very interesting impact on the Russian population. I read a report quite recently from Germany by a journalist who talked about listening to Russians discuss it, the population, openly, on television and in the streets, and they say, you know, Putin made a terrible mistake with his incrementalism. He should have struck decisively right away. And this war has now moved from being a limited operation involving exclusively professional troops to a people's war. We need to finish this thing. We need to get it over with, and we need to strike decisively. So this is not weakening Russia. It hasn't destroyed cohesion. It's building unity, and it's building support for the war that Putin says is necessary. So I think that's important.
So this is now the description you just gave us. Let's use the right force and get it over with. This is now the consensus of the Russian public. It is not Putin's a monster or Putin's incompetent. It's Putin is correcting his original mistake, and we're supporting him. Is that a fair summary?
I think that's a fair summary. You know, the other thing, too, to keep in mind is these reservists are going into groups of Russian forces that are collecting in the south and on the borders in the western part of Russia and in Belarus. And these forces are going to be quite large by the time they are amassed, but they will not be used in mass in a concentrated fashion, I would say, until November. What you're seeing happen right now, after all of these massive counterattacks launched by the Ukrainians that achieved, frankly, nothing strategically at all, they've taken such horrendous losses that now local Russian forces are taking back the terrain that was lost. This is happening down near Liman. It's happening in the direction of Bakhmut. It's happening in Kherson. The very few kilometers that they managed to scrape out are being lost. I think what we're watching are modest attacks by the Russians to straighten lines and set the conditions for the really large offensive that will break in November.
Is there a
ground freezes? Remember, that's a precondition.
Is there a military purpose to the recent attacks, heavy attacks on civilian and populated areas by the Russians?
Yes. This was not, by the way, they say, well, we didn't attack non-military targets. Wait a minute. If it's vital infrastructure that provides power to the railroads, power to the population to heat itself, if it's destroying transportation infrastructure that moves food and supplies, those things are militarily important targets. So this propaganda is, well, now Putin's attacking the people. Shut up. He never has. This is serious. And
let me make another suggestion. Might the attacks on populated areas be a military goal of getting the Ukrainians to move their anti-aircraft defenses away from the front lines and back to the populated areas, thereby giving more support to the Russian troops on the ground?
There were 3 salvos of missiles launched, 202 missiles. The Ukrainians claim to have shot down 27% of those missiles with their air defenses. We have no way of knowing. Can't validate it. May be true. But we do know that the Russian attacks destroyed 80% of Ukrainian air defenses.
Wow.
That's a very large number. And that's why Zelensky was on the phone almost immediately with Biden pleading for more air defense systems. Secondly, those missiles struck the infrastructure I just mentioned, and they also destroyed key targets where there were intelligence analysts, including the secret police headquarters in Kyiv. These things were targeted so that the Ukrainians would know 2 things. Number one, we can do what the Americans can do. We have the precision-guided munitions. We have the technology and the capability. Number 2, you cannot hide from us. When we finally attack, we will strike just as we did now, only in far greater ferocity, far more targets throughout the depth of the country. These are the things that he refused to do back in February, would not even contemplate it. That's off the table now.
So what do you suspect are the conversations in the State Department and the Defense Department of the U.S. and at the National Security Council in the West Wing? Are they reconsidering whether it was wise ever to support Ukraine? Are they suggesting more support?
Thus far, every time there was reason to re-examine the wisdom of what we were doing, we doubled down on the dumb idea. And so I don't expect that to change. But what I do see a lot of evidence for now is fear. There's a lot of fear in Washington right now. This is a sea change, if you will, a dramatic shift on the Russian side. This is something they didn't expect. They thought that somehow or another we could bully and intimidate Putin and the Russian people. It's impossible. The opposite has happened. And now the Ukrainians are running out of manpower. This business of they have limitless manpower. Well, if you take someone who's a grandfather, someone who's 16, you hand them a weapon, put them in a uniform and say, go to the front, I guess that's limitless manpower. But that's a hell of a way to fight a war. And that's what's happening today in Ukraine.
Who does winter help and who does winter hurt?
The Russians have all the fuel they need. They have all the heat that they could wish for. Their infrastructure is largely intact. They have logistical infrastructure for their forces, thanks to the rail system that has not been disrupted and cannot be disrupted by the Ukrainians. So I would say the Ukrainians are in a lot of trouble. They could end up freezing and starving just as much as many Europeans in the West are this winter.
How much longer can this conflagration go on before the Russian people lose support for Putin? Or stated differently, how much longer can he tolerate a the absence of a decisive victory?
Well, first of all, I don't see any evidence of anyone in Russia preparing a coup to remove Putin, period. Could that change? Well, I suppose anything's possible. But I think President Biden's departure in the future is far more likely than President Putin's departure under any circumstances. And I think that what he's preparing to do, what I think the general staff has finally persuaded him that they need to do once it occurs, I don't think it's going to leave us with very many options. So I think at that point, if we want anyone in Ukraine, what's left of it to survive, we will have to intervene and urge talks.
My friend from CNN, Jake Tapper, interviewed the president last night. It was a very interesting interview. Jake asks great questions. Some of the answers seemed to me to be rehearsed, but one of them startled me a little bit when Jake asked him, you made these comments threatening President Putin not to get too aggressive and not to use or to threaten to use nuclear weapons. Have you instructed the Department of Defense to prepare for this? And his answer was, I didn't have to tell them. They knew what to do. What are they doing? What are they preparing for?
I can't imagine it because I listened to someone talk to me about New Jersey and New York where some sort of medication was being provided that would have some anti-radiation benefits, which I thought was ridiculous. Maybe the pill will keep you alive 2 or 3 days longer, but the bottom line is if we were engaged in a nuclear confrontation, we have no means of stopping the warheads coming in on an intercontinental level. It's impossible. Again, that's why I regard this as nonsense. Now, what is the Defense Department doing? They seem to be much more focused on wokeism, CRT, and purging the ranks of anybody who raises objections to it than anything else. I don't see any dramatic improvement in readiness, training, cohesion, or anything else. So I don't know what the president's talking about.
Are we continuing to deplete our own military stockpiles to the point where we don't have surplus anymore? And what we're sending to Ukraine, we're sending from our needs, not from our excess.
I think we're already there. Frankly, the few people I talk to that are involved in this have said, we haven't got much more to send without putting our own war fighting capability at risk. So I think that's already happened, just as depleting our strategic oil reserve is a serious mistake as well. Now, I don't think we have much further to go. Europe obviously has nowhere to go at this point. They're in very serious trouble over there. No one ever broadcasts these mass demonstrations that are occurring across Western Europe. And you would think that Mrs. Meloni, who was just elected in Italy, is the return of Mussolini now, which is absurd. And so the people in charge, the woke globalists, internationalists, and neocons all seem to be bent on destroying anyone and anyone who raises objections to their policies. And I don't see any end to that until these people are gone here in the United States. I don't know how we do that.
I know that Intel is not your personal experience, but you certainly understand the way it works. Do you think that American Intel, the high level people who meet with the president, not the grunts on the ground who are gathering facts, the high level people are still misleading him and telling him what he wants to hear? Or is anybody telling Joe Biden what you just told our audience, fortunate enough to have and to hear you?
He has someone in his cabinet who could tell him the truth anytime he cares to hear it, and that's William Burns, who is the CIA director. Very capable man. So that your question really needs to be directed to him. As far as others are concerned, I'm not sure that President Biden is not simply repeating, reading, stating whatever the people around him want him to do. I've never been convinced that this is the original Joe Biden. I don't think it is, because Joe Biden in the past was a radically different personality from the one we're dealing with now.
Well, I think I've told you this, and I've mentioned it on air a couple of times, that my first assignment on a law school faculty was Delaware Law School. This is back in the early Reagan years. And I was a full-time professor, and there was an adjunct on the faculty that everybody in the faculty thought didn't belong on a law school faculty. But I got along with this guy, and students liked him because he had a very nice personality. It was Joe Biden.
Sure.
And he and I have been friends since. You are right. Now, I haven't been with him since he's been vice president. I was with him once during his vice presidency on a train where he offered a seat next to me. He made the Secret Service guy get up. So he remembers his friends from the old days. But it is clear just from watching him last night with Jake Tapper, this is not the same person that I had lunch with or that I talked about talked with in the hallways of a law school or sat next to on the Acela during that south part of the trip from New York down to Washington. He would always get on at Wilmington. So somebody is either telling him what to say. We've known that, and somebody is making these decisions. Is Lloyd Austin making these decisions?
I doubt seriously that he's making any decisions. I don't know what he's doing other than prosecuting a war against white supremacy and anybody else that questions the administration. You know, I think President Biden willingly, probably unwillingly, I have no idea, is part of what increasingly looks like a very complex and effective psychological operation that's being launched largely out of the United States and Great Britain to persuade people of several things. First of all, Ukraine is winning. Go back to 25 February, the day after the war began. Ukrainians are winning. Ukrainians are winning. Go to mid-March. Ukrainians are winning. Ukrainians are winning. You know, mid-April, Ukrainians are winning. Russians are losing. I mean, how many times do you have to hear this stuff before you finally say, well, if they're winning, why isn't it over? Why is this thing continuing?
Well, we must be hearing it because my friends in the media are getting this information from intel sources who want it out there, irrespective of whether it's the truth.
Of course. But we've been through this before. What happened when we went into Iraq in 2003, the WMD myth, you know, which was perpetrated from the highest levels and reinforced by everyone in the media. There was nobody that stood up and said, look, you want to go get rid of Saddam Hussein? That probably, you know, you can make a case for that, provided you focus on that and leave after it's over. Nobody went down that road. The whole idea was, how do we get in there and how do we stay as long as possible? Terrible questions, but that's what happened. So I don't think this is all that unique. And we've tried to do to Putin what we did to Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi and Assad and everybody else that doesn't go along with us.
How much longer does this go on, Colonel? Will we still be talking about this in the spring?
I hope not. I think that militarily it could end in November, December timeframe, judging from what I see building up for action in Ukraine. But again, that's not going to happen for another 3-4 weeks. certainly not until the ground is solid. And then I think we will see the gloves completely off, and the Russians will put an end to this war. Now, what happens at that point when it becomes abundantly clear that it's over? What are we going to do? Are we going to try and replace whomever is dead with someone else and make them do something? I have no idea. I think our own conditions here in the United States are worsening. Again, how do you make this economy well? We're headed to 4% on the 10-year treasuries. At the same time, the Chinese and the Japanese are dumping U.S. treasuries. How do you peddle your U.S. treasuries? How many can the Fed buy? We haven't even talked about inflation per se. I mean, how do you keep the whole economy from seizing up? I don't know. And then we haven't talked about the massive influx of illegals and the breakdown in the rule of law across our major cities. So we're supposed to ignore all of these things that I just mentioned in favor of prosecuting this endless war to remove Putin, which is not going to happen.
Well, a colonel, I almost called you general, colonel. I mean, that's why we fight wars, to get the public's mind off of domestic ills. War is the health of the state. People pay more taxes. They step in line. They support their troops. It doesn't always happen. Didn't happen with Vietnam. It certainly has happened at other times. George W. probably had an 80% approval rating when he lied us into the war in Afghanistan. It certainly takes people's minds off the domestic woes. I wonder, and Colonel, I fear that that's what Joe Biden has in mind. He was so bellicose in the past 2 or 3 interviews, not only this one with Jake Tapper, but recent snippets of what he said. That, again, this is not the Joe Biden that you knew, that I knew. And I think that that's where we're going.
And
we may very well have started World War III without even knowing it. I mean, suppose one of those missiles that Putin sends to destroy the secret police headquarters or a railroad line kills American special forces.
Well, the truth is that I think Americans have already died there in some of the strikes, and that goes back several months to a strike that went in near Lvov, up near the Polish border, and killed unidentified UK, US trainers, support contractors, and so forth. I think that's already happened, and we don't normally mention that because to do so could entail serious problems here at home. Thus far, we've had a very quiescent, compliant Congress, willing to fund and go along with anything the administration has wanted. I think the support is beginning to erode there as well. No one can tell us why this is vital for us to perform this task. We're told, well, again, Putin is going to conquer Eastern Europe. But on the other hand, Judge, Putin, his army is terrible. It's incompetent and can't get anything right.
Right. They're making both ends of that argument.
Yeah. Where do we come out on this whole thing? And first of all, no, the Russian armed forces are not large enough and strong enough to attack NATO, and nobody in Russia wants to do that. So I agree with that. But the other two arguments are just ridiculous. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and it certainly has nothing to do with attacking Eastern Europe. The danger, in addition to what you just meant, is we don't know what's going to happen in Poland. And the Poles continue to be very, very bellicose. And one wonders if they could not inadvertently cross borders, either into Belarus or into Ukraine itself. And what would that do? But at the same time, NATO is crumbling. Everybody says, well, we're stronger than ever. Let's have another grip and grim picture with all the NATO leaders. But the NATO alliance is in tatters. The populations want nothing to do with this. The Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, they're all looking and say, wait a minute, we don't want our country to look like Ukraine does the morning after the 202 missiles struck. They're not.
Well, you mentioned Mrs. Maloney. I mean, she wasn't elected just because of domestic issues. So that's a mainstay in NATO, basically saying we're not going to have anything to do with this. Absolutely. And I think you've said earlier that Germany and France are going to go in that direction as well.
We're going to see serious unrest in France and Germany in the near future until the current governments are gone. There will be a turnover there. How this is affected, I don't know. But I think it's going to happen. We're going to watch Truss struggle to survive. That's a catastrophe. So
Right.
who are we kidding? This is what you want to take to war? Have we lost our minds? Yes, we've lost our minds, and we are not prepared to fight. So the truth is coming out, albeit very slowly. Remember, how long were we in Vietnam before people finally woke up and said, "Put an end to this"? Well, really,
Right.
to the American people's credit, about what, 3.5 years, we elected Nixon. Our sons, our fathers, our husbands, daughters, whatever, killed over there, at least not in great numbers.
Not yet.
Not yet.
I hope I'm wrong. Colonel, always a pleasure. Great conversation. Thank you for your time. I know the audience, which watches you in huge numbers, greatly appreciates you as well. We'll see you again soon, sir. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. God bless.
And back to you and your family. Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.